You are Locked On Reds, your daily Cincinnati Reds podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, for today's Locked On Reds, I've got with me Lance McAlister. He is the host of Sports Talk on 700 WLW, and he, as much as anybody, as much as we all are, for when it comes to information for this lockout period and talking about baseball, we've been limited, Lance. It's been interesting to see how all of this has come about. So I've pivoted a little bit to doing a way too early look ahead to the season and some burning questions around big players when it comes to the Reds. Plus, we're going to talk about some Mount Rushmore items. But first, how are you doing, sir?
I am well, and I'm very happy you reached out because it is a chance to talk baseball. And nobody's been talking. Like, somebody talk baseball with me. There's nothing going on. I've been so limited, and so when you reached out, I said, "Heck yeah," because I'll take it in any way I can get it. I need a fix. So,
I'm happy to talk baseball. I always know that, and having left the radio station, I haven't got the chance to work with you for a while. So I'm glad to have you back on the show and get that chance. Because, yeah, I mean, with this offseason, I think we all expected the Reds were going to be even just a little bit boring themselves by not doing a ton of transactions or signings or things like that. But at least we would have the minor league signings with invites to spring training and waiver additions that they would most likely be focused on, and maybe a trade of a big guy or two, which I don't even really want to think about the idea of losing Luis Castillo and Sonny Gray or Tyler Mahle or anything like that. So let's look at a Eugenio Suarez. Let's look at the guy who I think after 2019, the torch was passed. He was the guy who was going to be the face of the franchise. And then for whatever reason, and it was probably the shoulder, it was probably not quite healing enough through 2020 and 90% of 2021, he wasn't good. He was a liability. And he was hitting home runs, but for the most part, his overall profile at the plate had really taken a dip. And then September happened. He did this weird September where everything was back to normal. So my big question is, what do we trust more going into 2022? Is it the pretty much whole season's worth of struggles that he had, or is it the hot September, and is he going to bounce back?
I've got to go sample size here, and I'm on one end of the scale. I'm going to put 800 plate appearances in 2020 and 2021 combined, and then I'm going to put probably 80 to 90 plate appearances in September. And as much as September excited me, and I said that's the Gino who got the contract and was a great deal for the Reds monetarily, I just those numbers tell me that he's the 800 appearance guy over the last two seasons. That's a 199 hitter. And just saying that out loud, I mean, to think in his first, 6 seasons, he's a 265 career hitter. And I'm not just going to base it on batting average, but he was a blossoming all-star. He was a power hitter. And to think of what he's been the last 2 years, be it whatever reason, whether it was initially we went through, it was the lockout and the stop and start of spring training, and he never got his timing down. And then it was the swimming pool accident and the shoulder and the surgery. Maybe the shoulder wasn't right. And then it became, maybe because the shoulder wasn't right, while it got healthy, he changed his swing plane. And you just kept looking for, there were moments last season I swore he needed glasses, and I became so desperate to explain what he needed. I would watch him, and I would say, I'd watch him swing at pitches that he missed by more than I've seen most players swing and miss pitches more. I mean, it wasn't like that much. He'd be swinging and missing at pitches, and I'm like, how could you possibly be looking at a pitch and missing it by that much? It was maddening. But I'm left at, in those 800 plate appearances over the last 2 seasons, he's a 199 hitter. You mentioned he is hitting for power. But, man, if you look, I know 31 home runs is hard to dismiss last year. But even from the previous season, his slugging has gone down. His OPS has gone down. I mean, there have been significant drops, even though he put up the 31 home runs, in his slugging percentage over the last 2 years. It's perplexing. I know people want to get rid of him. The reality is, as you know, he's got 3 more years left on a deal at $11 million. I guess the fortunate thing is it's not 3 more years at 16, 18, 20 million. And he's going to hit some home runs, but I see no reason to believe the Eugenio Suarez of pre-2020 is going to come back. I hope it does, but I wouldn't bet on it coming back.
I'm with you. I think I'm a little bit realist when it comes to him. I've lost the optimist goggles for Gino. I love Gino. Personality-wise, he is one of the easiest guys to root for, one of the easiest guys to like. It seemed like this past year. I mean, looking at his splits, there was no month outside of September that he got on base 30% of the time. Everything was less than 30% of the time. And then all of a sudden, it's a 460 on base in September. It's just almost, I mean, I don't want to say that I think that he's at this level because I sort of wonder about this guy, but it's almost Aristides Aquino-like. Like, the only hit he gets is a home run now. And it makes you wonder as to how much you can trust him. And there's so much money between him and Mike Moustakas that is tied up in third base. You really, really want to see a bounce back from one of those guys. And I'm a little bit worried about both of them. We're not really talking about Moose on this episode, but from a Gino perspective, I'm with you. There were so many times where it was like, and it was inexplicable almost, where he would swing at a slider that was breaking down by his shins, and his swing plane was about with his numbers.
Yes.
And you're like, what?
Yeah.
But then the next pitch, somebody would hang a curveball, and then he'd blast it, and you're like, oh, well, Gino's fine. He really wasn't. He was just kind of, I don't know. I think he was lucking into some pitches.
And Jeff, the other thing for me that has nothing to do with analytics, and it's just a personal thing, he is so well liked and respected by his teammates. You can feel their pain for him. I watch in the dugouts after he has a moment that goes well, and to see how he's welcomed back into the dugout. And it may sound corny, it may be cliche, but you can tell his teammates root for him. And they talked openly about being happy when he experienced success or had a game-winning hit. So it'd be one thing if the guy were just a complete jerk that nobody liked, who you could dismiss so easily, but you can feel his pain. I think his teammates feel his pain and frustration. You see that just on the looks on their faces and the hugs they give him after a good moment for him. They truly feel for him, and I just think it says a lot about his character and how well he's respected and embraced in that clubhouse.
You could be excused if you tuned into a Reds game at the moment when he is rounding, he's crossing home plate after hitting a home run, and the reaction that the dugout gives him. You could be excused for thinking that he just hit a walk-off home run. But then you look at the scoreboard, and it's like the third inning, and you're like, oh, no, that's his teammates getting behind him and just showing the love that they have for him and the appreciation they have for his successes, because last year they just it felt like there were 31 successes and maybe a couple of more outside of that, but for the most part it was a year of frustration for him, and hopefully he bounces back.
No, I always say that a player, we can use the back of the baseball card cliche, but I say slump becomes a trend, becomes reality. And we're deep enough into this that this is the reality of Eugenio Suarez. I don't know. I'd love to find a career profile of a player who did what he did for his first 6 seasons. And it's not like if Eugenio was 37, 38 years old, there'd be a lot more to factor in for an explanation. But, when you're in your early 30s, just into the 30s, and you've done this, I struggle to find a career profile that would match for success to the extent he had it for his first 6 years. 265 hitter, power hitter, all-star, and then for 2 consecutive years just be a 199 guy who's reduced to pop and just making outs every other plate appearance. It doesn't make any sense.
I'm with you, and I'm curious to see, because one thing I've also been looking at, and I'm calling them the way too early projections, simply because Fangraphs, the steamer projection model, is always working, no matter what time of year. So I'm saying it's the too early projections for him. We're going to take a gander at that here in just a moment. But first, before we do, I wanted to let everybody know that you are listening to the Locked On Reds podcast, and thank you for making us your hashtag first listen of the day. With me is Lance McAlister. We're talking about Eugenio Suarez. We're also going to be talking about some Mount Rushmore items here coming soon. Going to be some fun there, because the seriousness of Eugenio Suarez it's a bummer, because we're talking about a dude who blows bubbles for a living on third base. That's the kind of guy that you really want to see bounce back. And when we look at these projections, just from Steamer, and I'm not going to go line by line here, but they actually do have him bouncing back slightly. They're thinking he's going to hit 224. He's going to have a 444 slugging and actually get on base 31% of the time in a 116 game sample size. Now, I think part of that is they're expecting a little bit more of a platoon with Mike Moustakas and what that might look like. And partially because it's not as if the model is factoring in the DH, which I believe is coming. I think once we finally get whatever CBA is negotiated, I think the DH is coming to the National League. So what that's going to make it interesting, I wonder if Gino gets more than 116 games there. But do you take that? Because we're talking about a dude that we kind of would figure would hit 3 or 4 in this lineup, but the reality is it's probably going to be 5 or 6.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And you make a good point about how he's going to be used, because it sets up with what the reality is. They have Suarez and they have Moustakas, and neither one's going anywhere. So it sets up as if somebody takes advantage of the opportunity and gets hot. You know how this works for 10 days, for 2 weeks, and they secure the job for a little bit longer. Maybe they get off running with it no matter who it is. But at this point, if you can get Eugenio's on base 31% of the time and give some pop and hit 224, hey, that's up from 199 overall the last 2 years, and that sounds kind of goofy to say it, but it's baby steps here. If you can get that, that's a baby step improvement from what he's given you the last 2 years, and you really don't. I mean, what are the options beyond that, other than seeing what Moustakas can do in his little sample sizes of opportunities?
Yeah, and I didn't realize, too, he really took a dip in walk rate this past year. He went from 13% in 2020, which, 2020 kind of being a small sample size in and of itself, but 13% in 2020 to 9% in 2021. It's just like, dude, take a pitch here and there, which I know that's not his MO. He's an aggressive hitter. He's a swing first type of dude. But when you look at him in the pecking order of this lineup, what would you say? I think you probably put Joey Votto and Jesse Winker at the top of your expectations list, and Jonathan India as well. Is he fourth, or is there somebody that you would look at that you'd say, no, I think I'm even thinking of this dude ahead of Eugenio Suarez?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, I mean, you would expect more out of Tyler Stevenson as he continues to grow and mature, and he's going to get more at-bats. You're going to have in some way, shape, or form the likes of Kyle Farmer, Jose Barrero, probably Nick Senzel, Tyler Naquin. So yeah, I mean, Suarez probably, and I think it's troubling if you're putting Suarez at 4 in terms of expectations. That doesn't, on this team, he's got to be, with what he's done, if they're going to be good, he's got to be down closer to 5, 6, 7 in terms of expectations. I think you've got to have more guys ahead of him you can count on and feel good about than ranking Suarez at 4 as the guy you're 4th highest in counting on for this season. That kind of sent a shiver down my neck when you said 4th, because if he's 4th, then there are some issues with this lineup.
Yeah, I think that they've got to go out and get a replacement, because I like Tyler Naquin. I do, but I don't necessarily know that you can count on both Tyler Naquin figuring out how to hit left-handed pitching and Nick Senzel staying healthy all year. So I feel like they've got to go out and get a replacement for Nick Castellanos, whatever that looks like. And not sure that they're going to pay enough to get a guy like Kyle Schwarber or something like that to come here. So you're probably looking at a lesser value than what Castellanos was for sure. But what that might look like in the end, I don't know. Like, Eugenio Suarez profiles as the guy who should have been at the top. And I think it's interesting that the Zips projections have come out so far as wins above replacement positionally for the Reds, and they actually don't have them that far out of a playoff type caliber team. Now, who's going to be here in the end? That's the biggest question. Who's still on the trading block and things like that. But Suarez is not a guy that's leaving. I agree with you. And I think that it would be a surprise on par with the Reds trading away Homer Bailey if they could actually trade away Mike Moustakas this offseason, just because I think the value is at the lowest point.
Yeah, and
So,
Nick Kroll has said we're not going to, attach prospects to get somebody to take a contract like they had to do when Jeter Downs and others went in the Homer Bailey deal. But the reality is, nobody in their right mind, no general manager right now is going to take Mike Moustakas off your hands unless they're getting one of your quality prospects to go along with it. Because who's raising their hand to say, yes, I'll take on $32 million in 2 more years for Mike Moustakas when he's been injured and the way he's looked for the last 2 seasons? It's not going to happen. It's a fantasy baseball trade. I get, you know how this is. People ask all the time, well, just get rid of him. And I say, well, what does that mean? Does that mean writing him a check for $32 million and telling him to go away? Because you're not going to be able to trade him. You're just not going to be able to trade Mike Moustakas. It's not going to happen unless you really feel the sting of giving up a prospect, and then that's going to leave fans saying, how are you building? How are you going to lay a foundation and build if you're giving up young prospects? And it's that cycle they've got to stay out of.
I think fantasy baseball, or I think like MLB The Show, whenever you go into the settings and you turn off like the ability for the computer to reject a trade, it's like, yeah, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in real life. But no, I think that the Reds definitely have to be better than relying on a Eugenio Suarez, but then I think individually as well, he has to take a step forward, because 2 years ago we were talking about that contract extension as a steal for the Reds.
Yep.
Now we're wondering, do we still think that it's a steal? Do we think it's an okay deal, or do we now think it's more of a handcuff deal?
I would say it's just short of a handcuff, just based on some of the other contracts they have. And Moustakas at 16. Suarez at 11 is an inconvenience, but I don't think it's an anchor based on his production. I think now 3 years, that's a little tough, but $11 million in this day and age. You know how the economic structure of the game is. $11 million is not off the charts insane. And certainly when we saw the initial terms of the contract when he signed, you thought, man, look at that. They are going to not have to pay him more than $11.5 million over any year of this contract unless they pick up his option. And it was great. Now it's clearly not great, but it's not one of the deals they've had in previous years, Homer, Bailey, and others, where you just thought, oh my goodness, what they can't get out from under it. I guess I'll sum it up this way: it could be worse.
Yeah, it could be much worse. Let's color us realists when it comes to Eugenio Suarez, with hope but not expectation that he's going to bounce back big in 2022. Let's table that, and let's talk about some fun stuff. Let's look back at the history of this franchise, and we're going to talk about Mount Rushmore here in just a moment. Before we talk about that, I want to let everybody know, coming up on Monday, going to have, or actually Tuesday, we're going to have Steve Granado from Locked On Angels on, going to talk a mock trade. I'm going to be as realistic as possible with this, because in my mind I'm screaming at the idea of trading Luis Castillo, but we're going to talk a mock Luis Castillo trade to the Los Angeles Angels. That's coming up next week. So let's have some fun, because I came up with this idea a couple of weeks ago with a Mount Rushmore of Cincinnati Reds, and I'm thinking Devou Park, maybe overlooking the Ohio River. You can see it from the stadium. Maybe over in Fort Thomas, you carve it out of the side of the hill. Maybe they take some money that they're not spending on the roster and they can purchase some land and start carving into it. Maybe up toward Clifton. I don't know. Stephen Offenbaker the other day from Reds Alert, he was just like, "You're going to put it in northern Kentucky?" I'm like, but you can see it from the stadium. I don't know. So when we do this, when we carve these 4 faces in, I almost think that 2 of them are like stone cold locks, not changing, pretty obvious. I'm curious as to your take about this, but the 4 that we kind of came up with yesterday on the pod was Pete Rose, Johnny Bench, Barry Larkin, and Joey Votto. And me and Steve actually kind of disagreed a little bit on this. He said Joey Votto, I said Frank Robinson, but I think that they're pretty close there. But I'm curious as to your 4, and I'm curious to see if you've got the first 2 the same too, because I think you probably do.
Yeah, I love exercises like this, because you got to factor in offense, you got to weigh the defense, you got to weigh longevity and impact on the franchise. You can determine how much weight you put on rings and championships when they were here if you want. But as you were saying it, my thought was initially, Rose and Bench are my two easiest ones to figure out. And then I've got three, in my mind, I've got three for the next two spots. And those three were Morgan, Robinson, Votto. And my next tier was Barry Larkin. And that sounds like I don't mean that to sound disrespectful to Barry, because I truly appreciate the all-around nature of his game. But I'm deciding, and since you sent me the text earlier, I've been going back and forth through Baseball Reference, looking at Robinson, looking at Votto, because the Robinson-Votto thing is fascinating to me. And you have to, and I assume we weigh this on just what they did as a Cincinnati Red in their uniform. And if you look how close Robinson and Votto are, I mean, Votto the better batting average and on base, but Robinson certainly more power, higher OPS plus. Joe Morgan, to me, the all-around stolen bases, the power, the speed, the average combinations, all of those. So those are my five, which if I had to reduce to four, I probably go down to leaving either Votto or Robinson out and keeping the other one for my fourth. And by recency bias, I'd probably go Votto, but I would accept all criticism for saying, how can you leave Frank Robinson off your Mount Rushmore? And as soon as I say this, if my dad listens to this, he will be calling me saying, you're out of my will. How did you leave Frank Robinson out of the Mount Rushmore of Cincinnati Reds? So,
well, we could maybe split the difference in, like, on one of the four heads, we can, like, just cement a bobblehead of that fifth player. Then he's always on the Mount Rushmore. But yeah, no, it's so interesting because I mean, obviously for a fact that it was the worst trade in baseball history that sent him away and sent him to Baltimore and Milt Pappas and whatever, that sucks. And I know that if he would have hung around, he would have been a key member of the Big Red Machine. He would have had a ring. It would have been the most intuitive thing ever. We probably would talk about him as the best player in franchise history had they not traded him. And I think that is the only argument that there is that his career as a Red was cut short by sending him to a different team. Yeah. And I'm with you too on Joe. Like, he's a hard one to leave off as well. The nice thing is we have a good problem. There's too many guys for this Mount Rushmore.
Yeah. And the point on Morgan is, you on one hand, you say, well, Joe was only here 8 years. But on the other hand, you say, look what he crammed into those 8 years. Look at the dominance in 8 seasons where in back-to-back seasons, he was the single best player in the game. He was the most impactful, dominant player in the game. But if you look at, and people will say, well, what did he do beyond 75, 76? Well, go back and look at 72, 73, 74. Look at 77. I mean, just the string of everything he did, the disruption on the bases and the power for a second baseman at the time. And Speedy was just, I mean, my goodness, he was just so damn good.
It's fun to think, because I always think of like guys who were here for maybe a year or two and just lit the world on fire, like the Kevin Mitchells and the Greg Vaughns and you know, the Trevor Bauers and things like that. He did it for 8 years. He took that and he made it even just almost a decade. 2 more years. It's like if you get to that 10-year plateau, then nobody's questioning the longevity thing and questioning the career as a Red. But yeah, man, it's tough. I'm with you. When I think about the Mount Rushmore guys, because I always think it goes beyond just good careers as a whole. It's like, how transcendent was he within the franchise's history, within the game of baseball? And then you look at guys like Rose and Bench who completely redefined their positions, which Pete Rose redefined a couple of positions, but Bench made catching cool and stuff like that. So I think of Frank Robinson and Joe Morgan and Joey Votto and Barry Larkin and those four guys. Those four guys could have a Mount Rushmore in their own right. It's a fun exercise to talk about. And you go back to old guys too, like Ed Rausch. And I don't know how Ed Rausch, Big Clue. Yep. And it's always hard to judge pitchers from back of that day, but you're talking about some real good ones and like Dolph Luque and Bucky Walters and
Paul Derringer.
Yeah. Those are some guys that I definitely think that they get passed over for the Mount Rushmore, but they absolutely deserve to be recognized.
Yeah, and back to Morgan for a second, because I think it has to factor in his importance to the Big Red Machine in terms of being that piece that was dropped into that lineup then in a time where AstroTurf had become a thing and speed was becoming more prevalent in the game, and Joe was the perfect like gasoline, as they've said, to the Big Red Machine. There was a lot of talent already there, but what Joe added when they dropped him in there, and he will tell you they helped him as well. It was a perfect fit from both sides. Joe had the reputation in Houston. Maybe he was a little bit surly or didn't get along with people, including his manager. But when he came to Cincinnati and was put next to Pete's locker, and that relationship began to bloom, and then Joe's impact began to affect the team, then the Big Red Machine really began to roll. But then at the same time, you go back to Pete moving to third base in '75 as a big piece for the Big Red Machine. So there are just so many pieces to that have to be factored in, and that's why it's such a great debate.
I love the Mount Rushmore stuff, and the off-season lockout or not, it's a perfect time to have that debate.
Yes.
Lance, I appreciate you coming on and talking some Reds baseball with me today, and hopefully looking forward to, I don't know, I keep thinking like Groundhog Day is probably about the time we're looking at the lockout ending. I've heard some people say maybe even March, but we'll see. I don't know. If you had to put a finger on a day on a calendar, where are you putting it?
Unfortunately for me, I put it somewhere in March. I start backtracking however many weeks they determine they'll need to get ready. And if that's 3 weeks out from opening day, unfortunately, it's going to be that long. I go on history that says there've never been games lost to a lockout. There have been, 3 other lockouts, and the season's always started on time. I can't believe they'll miss games. But I think, you know how negotiations are. Nothing gets done until the very last minute. And I think in both minds, their drop dead is going to say, well, we'll keep pushing, and then it's going to be, March 7 or whatever in that range, and everybody's going to say, all right, we got to get to the table, we got to get this done, and we got to get guys to camp by Monday with flights arranged, and it's going to be last minute. And then we're going to have storylines of injuries because guys weren't fully ready, and just that's the sad thing. But I think we're going to have baseball on time ultimately on opening day, and I'll take that. So
that's my thought too. Lance, I appreciate having you on, and we'll do it again soon. Hopefully we'll do it shortly after the lockout ends.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I love doing this, and happy holidays to everybody. Merry Christmas.
All right. Thank you very much.